Welcome to This Week in Impact, where we bring you some of the most interesting impact investing and sustainable finance stories of the week, as covered by ImpactAlpha. I'm Brian Walsh. It's Thursday, September 26. Happy Climate Week to all who celebrate. I'm joined today by ImpactAlpha's editor, David Bank. We'll discuss some of our takeaways from the week, including the excitement around early-stage climate startups, the continued need for scale, both bigger checks and bigger investable opportunities, and how carbon markets might not be solving the climate crisis, but at least are helping to finance important developments in the global south. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, David. How are you?
I'm great, Brian. Climate Week's a bit of a long haul, but the end is in sight.
Indeed. And it was great to see you in person for the first time in many years, even though we speak every week. So that was a nice added bonus to this week's Climate Week.
You run into all kinds of folks at Climate Week.
All right, well, first up, among the diplomats and scientists and activists and policymakers, there were plenty of entrepreneurs looking to pitch their climate startups to potential investors. David, you were involved in the MIT Solve finals, featuring some interesting early-stage climate impact companies. What did you make of the companies you saw there?
Well, you're right. The entrepreneurs who are working on climate startups really are the sort of heart and soul of Climate Week. And there are dozens, if not hundreds of them, at many events across town. And it really is kind of heartening in the sense that I think if you're a ambitious engineering student at one of the big universities or coming up from Latin America or from Africa, climate tech and climate startups really is kind of the new thing for startups. And, just for one example, there's several companies that are trying to figure out how to use sargassum. This is the seaweed that's run amok all over the Caribbean and other places as a result of the warming seas. And it's clogging, beaches and creating a big mess. But it's also just an amazing source of biomass. So people are figuring there's a company called SOS Biotech that's talking about a kind of cosmetics and fertilizer made from sargassum. There's Bioplaster out of Mexico that's doing biodegradable packaging from sargassum. So again, what they're talking about is from seaweed to solution.
From seaweed to solution. But is there money to be made in these startups?
Well, that's why they're there pitching, and they're trying to get in front of the investors. And frankly, it surprises me how difficult that is. For example, I met a company called Freshean, Freshean, that has a nanotechnology kind of filter that can take carbon out of the air, apparently 10 times cheaper than the current going rate. And you'd think that folks would be beating a path to his door, but he's still pushing to get the startup funding there. There's a company, Plantair, that has a kind of concrete, a green concrete that actually serves as a kind of bed for plants to grow. So they have an image of whole cities with buildings covered with green plants growing. Not only the concrete is green, but then the buildings become kind of negative carbon as they absorb carbon. But again, getting into the building and construction industry with a new kind of concrete, you have to get through not only safety concerns, but sort of durability concerns and just kind of the received assumptions of the incumbents in that industry. So there's always going to be problems getting these things to market, even though the enthusiasm and even the science is quite exciting.
So David, what does the fundraising environment look like for the startup ecosystem right now?
Well, actually, it's not terrible for these early stage startups. And in fact, because they're smaller check sizes, and folks are kind of spraying and praying, as it were, with smaller companies. The very early stage funding has kind of come back, but overall climate tech funding is still way down from the frothy days of a few years ago. And I think in the first half it was something like $11 billion, but that's even lower than last year, which was not good. So folks are having trouble at the Series A, Series B growth stage rounds, as we've been reporting. But again, hope springs eternal, especially for the seed stage and early stage startups.
All right, well, let's take a quick break on that note. When we come back, we'll shift from early stage climate startups to how we effectively scale climate solutions. David, one thing we heard throughout Climate Week is the urgent need for scale. More money, whether from philanthropy or other catalytic capital providers, from institutional investors, and from governments. But it's not just more money, it's smarter money that is focused on backing effective solutions. What did you learn this week about the need for scale?
Well, I would say that it was kind of sober. There was a lot of, off the record conversations and folks kind of copping that many of the ideas or the ambitions, as it were, of the last few years have either not come to pass or have actually flopped. And so I think there's a kind of sober realism setting in. The fabled $100 billion that the developed countries were supposed to be supplying to the emerging markets to help with their climate transitions, that's been a perennial sore point in the kind of COP level discussions, and that still has not been resolved or solved. Mia Mottley, who's the Prime Minister of Barbados, has been ringing the bells on that, and she said something like, if this sounds like we're saying the same thing every year, it's because it's because we are. So I think there's something of a reality setting in that the kind of big wave of funding to generate this global transition has not really come to pass. That said, there are pockets of activity, and Altera, which is a fund out of the United Arab Emirates, has been putting down big chunks and big checks into climate funds. So things are happening at the kind of $1 billion and $1 billion plus level. And catalytic capital has played a role in de-risking some of that, and institutional investors are coming in. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And as you say, though, it's not just more money, it's smarter money. We talked to Catherine Stodulka at Systemic, with a Q at the end, who's been helping design and put together some of these kinds of deals, and she had this to say about scale.
You may have heard the stat which says, 1 in 6 projects which are investing in adaptation actually increase the vulnerability to climate change rather than reduce it. And that kind of stat means that it's not always just a question of money. It can be a question of design, a question of who is deploying or sort of looking at the project development for some of these critical issues. And also, if it's just a question of the scale of money, then sometimes we will also come to the wrong decision. So a great example might be restoring your coral reefs or your mangroves may actually reduce vulnerability for coastal communities. And it can also create, or tackle some of the food insecurity challenges, because it becomes a breeding ground for critical marine species, which support, feeding communities and livelihoods related to fishing. But a classic kind of adaptation play might be building a seawall instead of restoring mangroves. And a seawall costs a hell of a lot more than it does to restore some of that natural capital. And really understanding then that we do need more money. Absolutely. The increased targets which are being negotiated at COP for climate finance are critical, but it's not just more money, it's better governance, so that climate finance is being deployed in the right way.
I think one of the interesting points that Catherine raises, and we heard a lot as well, is that kind of every agenda is now the climate agenda. So the food security is a climate issue. Water, obviously, is a climate issue, and in fact, all of sustainable development, frankly, now is a climate issue. So at some level, that's alarming. We have a hurricane, bearing down on Florida, and climate change is here as we speak. But also it means that the funding flows and the capital allocation in all of those fields is now increasingly has to be sort of climate smart and climate aware, and that does bring more players in and more interest and more awareness. And I think folks are obviously realizing that climate action is imperative, and climate change is inescapable.
And we're already paying for climate impacts right now, so might as well get ahead of it with better adaptation and risk management.
we're all paying for it. We're paying for it in our groceries. We're paying for it, in our insurance premiums. We're paying for it in all kinds of ways. Climate inflation is here.
Climate inflation. Now, where else have I heard that this week?
We had a guest post from Andy Behar at As You Sow that ticked it down, and they in fact have created an archive of examples and articles that point this out. How climate change is now showing up in your pocketbook every day and every week.
All right, well, let's take another quick break. But when we come back, how carbon markets might be helping to solve the issue of climate adaptation. David, carbon markets are seen as a necessary but perhaps insufficient tool to help us reach climate resilience and adaptation goals. But first of all, just take a step back. Can you give us a brief overview on what we mean when we say carbon markets?
The first thing to know, Brian, is there's two big buckets. One is what people call the compliance markets or the mandatory markets for carbon. And those exist in Europe, and California has one, and some of the Northeast states have them, and China has the beginnings of one. And I think something like about a quarter of global emissions are covered under some kind of carbon market. Those are proceeding and in large part working. The other part is much smaller, but it gets more attention, are what are called the voluntary carbon markets. And those are carbon credits. People sometimes think about carbon offsets that corporations generally buy in order to reach their net zero goals. And so they fund reforestation or mangroves or other kinds of carbon projects that sequester carbon. And there's a wide variety of quality and pricing for those kinds of offsets and carbon credits. And frankly, they've come into a bit of disrepute in recent years. Many folks have pointed out the fallacy, for starters, of being able to continue to pollute while you buy carbon credits. So that's the first problem. And the second is the quality of some of those credits, whether the carbon really is sequestered. People think that avoided future carbon is a less robust commodity, as it were, than carbon that's actually taken out of the air. And then there's all kinds of measurement questions around it. So prices have fallen and kind of the reputation has fallen in recent years.
Right. But as we reported this week, though, as these carbon markets fall short as a climate solution, they are helping to go further in financing sustainable development. So can you talk us through how that has been the case?
Well, that's always been something that I've keyed on, because you can say, well, it's highly imperfect as a way to reduce carbon emissions, but as a way to get global corporations to pay for sustainable development projects in the global South and emerging markets, it's not a terrible mechanism, because and you can say that it's greenwashing on the part of the corporations, but they are pushing now some billions of dollars, and these go to communities that can now have a new revenue stream for preserving their forests, for preserving their mangroves on the coast, which also have all these co-benefits of protecting against storm surges, and folks that sell clean cook stoves can now get an additional revenue stream, not just from selling the cook stoves, but from the carbon credits, and that reduces the price to consumers. And again, clean cook stoves have all kinds of co-benefits of cleaner air and lower costs for poor families in their cooking costs, electric vehicles, solar lighting, all kinds of things that are very essential to sustainable development are now getting essentially subsidized by these carbon credit revenues. And that's not a bad outcome, even if you're not necessarily saving the world from climate change.
So tell us about some of the efforts being done to kind of create better carbon crediting standards and bringing better transparency to this market, so it could become actually more robust, and not just in, driving financing to the global South, but also in actually mitigating carbon emissions.
Well, again, as I said, taking carbon out of the air and being able to then sequester it and hold it for some number of decades, if not centuries or millennia, is a much more robust thing to be paying for. And so some of that is like literally direct air capture and carbon removal instead of just carbon avoidance. And so those kinds of projects fetch much higher prices. The other thing, of course, is just being able to measure even the carbon avoidance at a more granular level. And there's been a lot of progress made, partly because of the skepticism and the critique of some of the earlier efforts. And you can now, have pretty good discernment on some of these marketplaces about the quality of credits, and the prices range now, from just a few dollars to $20, $30, $40 per ton. None of that gets really, of course, to the real value or social cost of carbon, which is probably well over 100, if not 200 or $1,000 a ton. But because of these measurement and kind of technical issues, the voluntary carbon markets haven't reached that. So I think you have this classic hype wave, peak of inflated expectations of a couple years ago of what might happen with the voluntary carbon markets. And then the trough of despair, which we've fallen into in recent years. But I think they will climb the slope of enlightenment and become a useful mechanism, both for accounting for carbon, but as I said, also for paying for sustainable development and all kinds of very necessary projects that have many benefits beyond the carbon savings.
All right, next gen carbon markets. We'll be watching closely. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Brian.
That's going to do it for This Week in Impact. Thank you all for listening. If you like the show, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen right now, and be sure to leave us a review and a 5-star rating. It really helps other people discover the show. This Week in Impact is a production of ImpactAlpha and part of the ImpactAlpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For more exclusive stories about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks as always to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh. We'll see you next week for more Impact.